Welcome to our session on alignments and realignments in the international order. The focus of this panel will be on Europe. I'm Andrew Parasiliti, president of Moderator.com, an award-winning media company covering the Middle East. If you haven't done so and checked out our site recently, you will be pleased to see our Monitor Pro premium offering, where we go even more deeply into some of the geopolitical, geoeconomic, energy, and technology trends that we'll be discussing in this panel and that have been featured in this debate. I'm also would like to say that I am both honored and humbled to be part of the Abu Dhabi strategic debate once again. I think I've been to every one of the debates, in-person debates, since it started. The Abu Dhabi strategic debate under Dr. Ibtissam Al-Khatbi's leadership has become a hub for these types of strategic discussions. So my thanks and admiration to Dr. Ibtissam for the work she is doing and the Emirates Policy Center is doing. Let me briefly introduce our panelists, and there are more extensive bios available in the app and the program, and then we'll get right into the discussion. Nickolay Mladenov, Director of Research and Analysis at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. Marcos Carnelos, Founder and CEO, MC Geopolicy. Dr. Charles Powell, CMG, Director, Elcano, Royal Institute, Madrid. And Dr. Cornelius Adebahr, Non-Resident Fellow, Carnegie, Europe. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to you all to this panel. Let's get into it. The defining issue for European alignment, we've been talking about it today, is the war in Ukraine. What is the consensus or lines of thinking in Europe, because I can assume that it's not a united consensus, on the end game for the war in Ukraine? Tell me how it ends or how European elites are seeing the end of the war. Or put it another way, what do you see as the best case, worst case, or most likely scenarios for how the war plays out and what it might mean for European security? And Nickolay, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you for a number of questions in there. But let me first reflect on something, because in the previous panel we heard that a Russian say that Europe is gone, and Americans say that America doesn't know where it's going. I suppose that the really grown-up thing to do is to remind ourselves that we actually do need to learn to live with each other. And I think for us in Europe in particular, that lesson has been an important part of our history, but certainly something that we need to remind ourselves now again as well. The war in Ukraine has brought a strategic choice to Europe that it has been postponing for quite some time. There's been a lot of back and forth in Europe as to whether we should, the strength of the transatlantic relationship is what keeps Europe together, or we need to look for strategic autonomy in Europe with a more robust posture and defense and other areas to be able to deal with our own challenges in the future. At least for the short term, that question has been answered in favor of the strong transatlantic link. And I say this for the short run because I think in the long run, Europe still needs to understand that it needs to develop its own strategic capability, its strategic capacity, its hard power as well as its soft power, to be able to manage the challenges that it faces on its own. In partnership with America, of course, in partnership with other parts of the world, but it's clearly reflecting more its own understanding of the world. Now, how that will happen is a question that remains open. Clearly, the institutions that we have in Europe that were built in the last decades are institutions that have been built in times of peace and prosperity. Now, we don't have peace, and we certainly have questions over prosperity. A lot of the institutions that Europe has need to adapt, and they need to change in that respect. Certainly, how decisions are being taken on a number of areas. And certainly as far as strategic interests that Europe has in its neighborhood and beyond. And lastly, I think what the Ukraine situation has really taught us is that the Russian invasion in Europe is seen pretty much in a black and white manner. Where I'm afraid Europe has failed, what I'm afraid Europe has failed to understand is that beyond Europe and North America, the situation doesn't look black and white. It doesn't look black and white when you look at it from the perspective of the Middle East, Africa, other parts of the world. And we in Europe are in great debt to the Ukrainian people, to everyone who is fighting at the front lines today. We're in great debt to them to try and explain better to the rest of the world what Europe is doing, and to try and accommodate more of the problems that other countries have, because other countries outside of Europe will reflect on the situation in Ukraine and on the war based on their national interest, based on their national understanding of the challenges that they face, and we need to be much more accommodating, I think, to different views in how we explain as well our policies. And that is where we are lacking. We're not lacking in terms of the strategic vision for the future of the European continent, of the European Union, of the relationship with NATO. We're going through this transition currently that has been imposed on us after the invasion, but we do need to reflect a little bit on our attitudes and goals in relation to the rest of the world as well.
Marcos, your thoughts on how the Ukraine war is affecting the strategic choices that Nickolay said had been deferred, but Europe is now making regarding the future of NATO, and how NATO and the world sees the war compared to how others see it outside of Europe. If you could reflect on those comments, please.
Thank you. I believe that we have the two dimensions in Europe. One is NATO and the other is the European Union. Let's see for a moment NATO. NATO is a success story, definitely, in the period of the Cold War and in the immediate period after the Cold War. So we should be clear what NATO is and how NATO is perceived in the rest of the world, in the sense that NATO core mission to provide peace and stability in Europe and in the North Atlantic theater has been a success, definitely. Out of area operation, we are in a mixed feeling here. We have, well, NATO was not directly involved in Iraq, was involved in Afghanistan. These are not success stories from many points of view. The point is, NATO should, I put in a very funny way, if it's up to me, I was the Secretary General, I would place a statue of President Putin in the conference hall of North Atlantic Council Hall, with something written below, the man who saved NATO. Let's not forget what the French president was saying about NATO 3 years ago, just 3 years ago, brain dead. Now we are in a completely different world. So NATO is doing well what has been mandated to do since 1949. But we should not make the mistake to consider, as it happened in the past, NATO as a tool that provides international legitimacy to certain solutions to certain crises, because until the system will not change, it's the United Nations that is providing this legitimacy. And this is also the opinion of what we are, today we have many definitions, global north. I would prefer to frame the situation as a global west, including Japan and Australia, and global south, not global north. Because in the global north we have also Russia and many other players. So from this point of view, what is in the global south is perceived. NATO is not let's say, an institution that is providing legitimacy. It's simply what it is, a Western politically and military alliance with very specific geographical boundaries, that is North Atlantic. So I was quite, in a way, amazed when I read in the new NATO strategic concept the part dedicated to China. I could barely believe to my eyes for what I was reading. Maybe I will further elaborate that on. As to the EU, the situation is, I would say it's quite different. I will be, as a European, I listened before some panelists mentioning the fact that European will disappear. I do not agree 100%. What I can say is that the Europeans, they are doing their best to disappear. In over 100 years, Europe has already suicided itself twice. One is the First World War, the second was in the Second World War. On the center point of view, we are watching a third attempt of suiciding. Early March, I wrote an article where I asked, who is going to crash first? Russia under Western sanctions, or some Western nation, mainly European Union, under the blowback of the sanctions adopted against Russia? And I'm afraid to say that this question is still up in the air and there's no answer in that. Last point I would like to make, just to emphasize how disappointed I am for certain decisions taken by the top European institutions. A few weeks ago, I ran through an article in Wall Street Journal that was saying that it is a Wall Street Journal, not me, and it's not a political statement, because it's Wall Street Journal. Europeans have been so far capable to fill the gas stock up to 93%. That is a very good news for the incoming winter. Then we discovered, always according to the Wall Street Journal, that this was possible because the import of Russian LNG has increased 41%. So someone should explain to me the logic to adopt a legitimate decision. We don't want any more gas from Russia, from pipes, and then increasing 41% the gas, LNG gas from Russia, that is more costly. So the question is, who is sanctioning whom in this situation? And this is my disappointment, because I don't see a clear, I can understand that the European Union, and I agree, for shared values, for what Russia did, for a lot of reasons, has decided, and in a way decided deliberately, sometimes was compelled to do what it's doing now. But I would like to see, where is the European Union strategic autonomy? Gone. Completely gone. And if I have to close, just to summarize, I was struck by what German Chancellor Olaf Scholz going to Beijing. And the message is, okay, let's not go to discuss how it happened, but we, Germany, have been in a way compelled or deliberately decided to sever our energy relationship with Russia. It's done. There's no way back, especially after the pipelines in the Baltic were blown up. But the sense of the message is coming out, at least from Germany, is to the Americans. Don't even think about, for a moment, to pretend that you are going to disrupt our trade relationship with China. So while NATO is very cohesive and is a paradox, because the major part of all the European Union members almost are part of NATO, there are two different dynamics at play, and I can detect inside the European Union certain tension that you are not able to see inside NATO, because if Europe was playing its part, definitely the NATO strategic concept approved in Madrid with a statement on China would have been drafted differently. Thank you.
Charles, NATO's already taken a series of steps following the Ukraine war, including the offering of membership to 2 new members. How do you see these changes? Do you believe Putin saved NATO? And again, what about the scenario for the future? Is the alliance strengthened when you're going to be facing a probably revanchist Russia for decade or decades? How do you see that in a Ukraine that's going to require a great deal of help and assistance?
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I'd also like to thank our hosts for their very kind invitation. This is my first Abu Dhabi strategic debate, and I hope it won't be my last. I think, first of all, for a non-European audience, it might be beneficial, as you were suggesting, Ambassador, to stress that NATO and the EU are obviously different but complementary. Just remember, for example, that all but 6 EU member states are also members of NATO. Only Ireland, Austria, Cyprus, Malta, and Finland and Sweden, who have applied for NATO membership, are not members of NATO. And sometimes our non-European partners and allies find it difficult to understand how we can wear 2 hats at the same time. And I understand this hardship because we don't understand it either. let's be totally honest. It does lead to intellectual and perhaps even political schizophrenia. Has the war saved NATO? As has been said, yes, we've moved very quickly from a position where some analysts and indeed President Macron himself were writing NATO off as being brain dead. I myself was, to some extent, a witness of this debate because my institute co-hosted the NATO Strategic Public Forum back in Madrid back in June. And I have to be very honest with you, in the run-up to this event, before the invasion on the 24th of February, I wasn't really sure what we were going to talk about. And the items on the agenda seemed remarkably unappealing. We were talking about the climate change security nexus. Okay, that's very important, and it's something we should talk about, but is that really NATO's top priority? Suddenly, Mr. Putin came along. He is, of course, NATO's best and most effective unpaid recruiter, as we now know, and everything changed. But ultimately, as has also been intimated, some of the fundamental problems in the European security architecture still remain. So yes, NATO has a new lease of life, but what about Europe in this equation? And how has Ukraine impacted on Europe, by which I mean Europe's member states, as members of both NATO and the EU? I think if we're optimistic, we could say that we've moved from a state of westlessness, remember the Munich Security Conference slogan a few years ago, to westernness. In other words, the war has revived the transatlantic relationship. But, as you were mentioning, what about European strategic autonomy? I was in seminars in Slovenia and Romania in September, and everyone was saying strategic autonomy is dead. Elsewhere in Europe, everyone is saying, on the contrary, European strategic autonomy is more needed than ever. First of all, we could have another lunatic in the White House, remember, in January 1925, which would be very alarming. Secondly, if the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that we had really allowed our economies to deindustrialize and to abandon certain key areas, and this is something that we simply cannot afford. We couldn't even produce our own paracetamol, for God's sake. So we were extremely vulnerable. And strategic autonomy, remember, is not just the autonomy to behave in the military and the foreign policy sphere. It has actually a lot more to do with industry and the digital world and R&D and so on. So I very much think that strategic autonomy is still there and still very much needed. So Europe has experienced a geopolitical awakening, or reawakening, if you like, as a result of the war, and the key player here is Germany. Zeitenwälder, this historic shift in German foreign policy, which is so often quoted, is probably the most important short-term consequence of the war. And perhaps Cornelius will discuss that and what this really means for Germany and Europe more broadly. But it's also alarmed the French. The French tend to get alarmed when they're not running the show in the EU, as you well know. And President Macron very cleverly came up with the concept of a new European political community, which has now met. It met in Prague in October, 44 members, European, EU, and non-EU. Now, I think this is an interesting invention, an interesting innovation, but what it proves, and this is what I really want to stress, is that our European security architecture is flawed. We don't really have a context in which we can talk to non-NATO and non-EU member states. I don't know whether this new EPC will provide it, but it might be a step in the right direction. Additionally, there's been a very interesting shift in the center of gravity in the EU towards the center and east of Europe, and the role of Poland here, I think, is worth mentioning. And finally, enlargement is on the agenda again, and this has a lot to do with Ukraine. Going back to your question, what can we actually offer Ukraine? The extraordinary paradox of the war is that Since they aren't part of NATO, we couldn't activate Article 5. Since they aren't part of the EU, we couldn't activate Article 42.7, the Mutual Defense Clause. And this is why we find ourselves in this very bizarre sort of proxy war. At the same time, we've offered them both the promise of NATO membership and EU membership. But if we are honest, we obviously have to admit that neither are on the cards in the short term, for the reasons I've just mentioned. Both of those articles would immediately kick in. So what can we really offer Ukraine? Well, the EU is offering sanctions, the eight waves of sanctions. Admittedly, they're not having the impact we hoped. Secondly, unprecedented economic and humanitarian aid. Remember, we've just signed up to an additional 18 billion euros for 2023. And thirdly, military aid. It's quite extraordinary that the European Peace Facility is now actively funding the military effort in Ukraine to the tune of about 3.1 billion euros. So this is not negligible. The question, of course, is where will all this lead us? You were talking about best case, worst case, and most likely scenarios at the beginning. I think the most likely scenario, sadly, is a stalemate in which Russia continues to occupy Crimea and the Donbass, which of course the Ukrainians will continue to claim, and one in which effectively, which might lead to a sort of mega frozen conflict on the borders of the European Union and NATO. And that of course is a pretty horrible prospect, I think, for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Cornelius, do you want to pick up on a number of themes that both Charles and the other panelists have raised?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd be happy to, and thanks to Dr. Ebtisam for having me, thanks to the colleagues for preparing the ground so well that I can just jump in on with a number of observations on the role of Europe. First about superpower, secondly about institutions, and thirdly about crisis. The superpower theme, I'm going to give it away. Europe is not a superpower, and I'm not pretending it is one. But I was intrigued by the logo of this conference, because there you see the European flag, the flag of the 27, pointing to the United States and in connection with Russia and China. But Europe, the European Union, I have to say, is so much different than the other three. You know, the three are permanent members of the Security Council, nuclear powers, superpowers, old and new, would-be superpowers, you name it. And then the odd flag out is that of the European Union. Because the European Union, as Ambassador Mladenov said, has realized that it has to live not only with the states inside of Europe, but also with countries outside of Europe, with the world that it is. The other three, they are still trying to dominate the world one way or another. Europe, after fighting it out over who's dominating the continent for centuries, has come to an agreement among themselves that there's a different way to go about this. And that's where the institutions come in. Because what is behind this flag is basically treaties and institutions. There is no nation state. There is no superpower. There is not even a super state of the European Union, even though the fear of a super state is what brought the Brits out of the EU at some point. So it's totally different, but in a way, it also, and I think it deserves to be here because the idea that has driven Europe through all these decades is something that is relevant to this region. And this is where your initial question about the end game, and we've already heard about Ukraine being offered membership of the European political community coming together, 44 countries. This is where the institutions are driving a process which is not so much geostrategically led. It's not led by one country. It's more this amorphous mass of Brussels institutions, i.e. bureaucrats driving it. And that's very much to the detriment of strategic thinkers. They would like the European Union to be more strategic, also to be a more active role in world affairs. But I would say the EU is a slow-moving tanker. And then the last point about crisis, because in the very first video, Europe was presented as the continent in crisis. And yes, you're right, Europe is in crisis, has continued to be for at least 15, 17 years by now. It started with an internal crisis about how to develop those very institutions and treaties. Then came the financial crisis, which turned into a public debt crisis inside the European Union, nearly breaking the Union apart. We've seen a migration crisis, we've seen COVID. I mean, the whole world has seen COVID, but it was also, again, something which went to the heart of the European Union, bursting at the seams and trying to hold this together through joint debt issuance, something that was unthinkable before. And now we are seeing the European Union in crisis over Ukraine, trying to find a way to deal with it. But as my predecessors have said, they are finding it. It is taking time, but it is something that is built into these institutions. It's the slow moving. I would give that answer to your question about the end game. It's slow moving. If the European Union promises Ukraine membership, at some point it means that Ukraine should become a member. If it helps to do so via a European political community of 44 states, creating something new, well, that is what Europe is good at, creating institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Nickolay, Charles mentioned that a most likely outcome is a stalemate. And the stalemate is an interesting word because the war can continue with incalculable costs over this time. How do you see the costs of a continued conflict or stalemate with Russia affecting EU unity around these issues of support for Ukraine? And overall, would it have any other effects on political trends that we're seeing in Europe, such as we've seen some political change in Italy, we've seen changes in the UK, obviously different and for disparate reasons, but how does it affect over time politics in the EU and the EU consensus?
Stalemate is a terrible outcome, even if it's for the short run or for the medium term of this conflict. It leads to a world divided, a world in which you have, some refer to as a new Cold War. I wouldn't use this analogy, but a world divided with parallel systems of financial transactions, parallel trade systems. I think the IMF recently came out that with data that 1.4% of global growth will be affected, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, if we end up in a divided world, with a small sliver of countries in between these two blocks, if you wish, that are able to trade with both. Now, such a scenario puts Europe clearly in one block of the economic situation. But Europe's internal pressures, I think, will be absorbed particularly by a number of factors. One is the institutions. Secondly is the fact that Europe's economy still remains strong, despite what we say. Thirdly, because of the pressure from outside. And I think Europe has always reacted to pressure from outside by consolidating. And we've seen this in different crises in the past, and I think we're going to see it in the current crisis as well. So I'm not that fearful of the political landscape in Europe changing dramatically in a way that Europe's fundamental positions on Ukraine change. Where we're likely to see is we'll see ups and downs depending on the domestic political situation in different countries. But one thing that will need to be addressed very quickly is the economy. And certainly that calls for countries like Germany, others as well, but first of all Germany, to come to grips with the idea that they do need to find the internal strength for the power, for the transformation of their economy that is necessary for the future. Sadly, that will also demand a certain price to be paid and certain pain to be borne by German voters and by German industry. But this is a pain that has already been shared by pretty much everyone else in Europe. And the sooner that this transformation begins, I think that the stronger the chance is that we will be able to weather the storm within a European context. Within a global context, it becomes far more complicated, I think, because if we end up in a situation where hostilities and a stalemate continue for 1, 2, 5, God forbid, 10 years down the line, if this becomes a frozen conflict, as so many other conflicts around Russia's periphery have become in the past, this one will be particularly damaging to global supply chains, to global growth, and will certainly affect all of us.
Marco, you mentioned in your comments earlier, and Nickolay alluded to this here, that the war has revealed some vulnerabilities in European energy security. Tell us a little more about that, how you see the evolution of energy policy based on the experience of the Ukraine war. What are the lessons learned, and what changes do you see happening?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the Emirates. I forgot to say at the outset, the Emirates Policy Center for the kind invitation and the opportunity. First of all, let me say that if from 10 years, 20, 30 years from now, we should define this period, we should define as the age of miscalculation. Everybody is miscalculating on everything. I mean, Russia miscalculated how easy was the military operation in Ukraine. Maybe the global West miscalculated how effective the sanctions in short period of time could have affected Russia, and so on, and so on. Let's say focus in a way on Europe. And then I will explain another miscalculation that is the biggest miscalculation of all. Recent data from the European Central Bank point to the fact that from today up to 2030, the challenge for Europe is to achieve a green transition, not complete it, but achieve it in a reasonable way. Diversify the energy supply. It's a fact. We have to do it for geopolitical reasons, it's evident. Bridge the digital gap, because this is another, and match the 2% military GDP military expenditures established by NATO. The overall bill of this commitment only for Europe is equivalent to an entire European Union recovery fund that were the 750 billion euro that were adopted to face COVID. So we are going to multiply the European Union recovery fund for the next 8 years, every year. It's 5.6 trillion that Europe only should spend in order to achieve these targets. It's something equivalent, if it's up to me, there's a vertigo in order to face such. And this challenge has to take place where the biggest miscalculation of all took place, and it is exactly the difference that we have from what we predicted green energy could ensure immediately now and in the next few years, compared with the targets, and then all of a sudden we realized that fossil fuel are still needed, unfortunately. I would like to have a green transition tomorrow. So this huge miscalculation, the bill that the European Union has to sustain in the framework of such miscalculation is something that is really, really dramatic. And I don't know if we will be up to this gigantic challenge, considering the tension that we are detecting inside the European Union. There's some fire smoldering under the ashes. The first signal was happened in the French election, where the far right was very, very close in a way to, and basically France has now a parliament that cannot work. And President Macron is thinking about to dissolve the parliament to go again to the legislative election because the system is not working. We had a result in Sweden that nobody expected. Sweden, the wonderful model for everybody. And we had the Italian elections where center-right, far-right, the debate is still ongoing. You know, the Italians debate for decades about sometimes trivial issues. Definitely it's a center-right party, some components. Now, not all this tension can be attributed to the war in Ukraine. Because I am part of the small school of thought that basically believe that Europe never recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. And we are still experiencing the long wave of the 2008 financial crisis, especially in terms of inequality and policy that have not been able to fix the problems of inequality. Yes, okay, we have been printing money for decades. Everybody's capable to print money when the inflation is under zero. But when the situation changes, as it's changing now, real strong character should come out and face a far more complicated situation. This is not going to be easy. And then we had the COVID, of course. And then last but not least, of course, the war in Ukraine. So it's a perfect storm. I think Adam Tooze, the historian economist, said it's a polycrisis coming all together. Of course, in the middle of that, we have Ukraine. Cartoon of this morning mentioned the resilience. The biggest resilience that we have been watching so far has been the Ukrainian resilience, heroic. But if we want to save Ukraine, because what I've been able to show to the world in terms of resilience, it's important that sometimes, soon, a dialogue is started. I'm in a way relieved at the fact that Jake Sullivan mentioned the fact that his constant dialogue with he has two Russian counterparts, as far as I know. One is Nickolay Patrushev, that is technically speaking his counterpart. The other is Yuri Ushakov, that is Putin political foreign policy advisor, the combination of the two main. I don't know if these talks are going to manage the situation in terms of not escalating. That is already something that we should aim to, or there's something in brewing, notwithstanding what we listened before in the American panel that says it seems something that is a script on the stone. Only the Ukrainian will decide when to deal. And so I believe the reality is a little bit more complicated than that. Of course, nobody can make an agreement behind Ukrainians. Of course, it should be shameful to do that. But something is brewing, and I hope it's going to brew even more.
We had briefly touched on earlier, China was brought up and how this was referenced by the EU. Charles, we've talked about China here at the Abu Dhabi Strategic Debate. The U.S. national security strategy identifies China as the chief rival and competitor of the United States. How does Europe assess its future with China, and how does it assess its future in the context of U.S. policy and strategy toward China?
The main point I would like to stress is that although we are not equidistant, we Europeans are not equidistant between China and the US, obviously, US and European interests are not identical. And this, I think, is a point that needs to be stressed and isn't often sufficiently understood outside Europe. In other words, even though, again, NATO and EU memberships overlap almost perfectly, we, as NATO members, have signed up to this rather belligerent NATO strategic concept, and I agree with the ambassador that this was probably uncalled for. And in fact, as far as I know, a number of European governments were rather unhappy with the language, but ultimately had to sign up to it precisely because of what the US was doing vis-a-vis Ukraine. There was a trade-off, right? You support the language on China, and we will continue to be fully supportive of the war effort in Ukraine. And this isn't entirely surprising. NATO is above all a military alliance, but also a political organization, and therefore we're used to these trade-offs. The important thing, though, as far as the EU is concerned, the important thing, I think, is that the European Union understands that China is a major global player, accepts the legitimacy of China's aspirations to play a more prominent global role, does not see itself as an adversary. It sees itself as a rival, essentially, perhaps, and a rival which sometimes contests the rules-based order to which we all subscribe. But I think the EU is much more subtle when it comes to dealing with China. Admittedly, of course, the EU is a broad church. I think you can identify three positions: the hawks, the doves, and the countries in the middle. The country where I'm based, Spain, is probably in the middle because the Chinese economic footprint is very small. Those closer to China obviously tend to be dovish, and those who have fewer Chinese investments tend to be hawkish. So this is a European reality. I think the European Union's role in the future will be to try to convince the US to avoid confrontation wherever possible. I think the US has also made some rather unfortunate statements vis-à-vis Taiwan. The Nancy Pelosi visit, for example, was probably uncalled for. You know, I'm a great admirer of Taiwanese democracy. I go there at least once a year. But that is not to say that the US can tear up 20, 30 years of diplomatic history. So, and again, I'm not talking about appeasing China. I'm talking about standing up to China when necessary, but at the same time understanding that China has a legitimate desire to play a more prominent role in the world order. Now, how successful will the European Union be? This remains to be seen. And the problem, of course, is the simultaneity, as you were saying, the polycrisis syndrome, the simultaneity of a lot of these challenges. The EU is effectively decoupling from Russia economically. That's what we're doing, because most of our relationship was energy related. We are weaning ourselves off Russian energy. That will be the end game of, it is almost, I think, on the horizon already. And at the same time, the US would like us all to decouple from China. So these are two very ambitious decoupling processes, and I'm not sure that we can afford to do those things simultaneously. So I think the EU has its own position. We form part of a think tank network called EPNEC, which studies bilateral EU-China relations, so country by country, not globally, not the EU globally, but German or French or Italian or Spanish relations. And this is what we're hearing from our colleagues in Europe who deal with the Chinese question. Having said that, of course, dealing with China is becoming very difficult. Many of our most prominent European colleagues have been sanctioned. They can no longer travel to China. They will never be given a visa. And I myself have signed a document promising never to go back to China unless those sanctions are lifted. And when we confront the Chinese authorities with this, they realize, I think, that they've probably gone too far. By the way, something else we've detected in our contacts with the Chinese authorities is that they are really pedaling back on the Russia agreement back in February. In private, at least, they are telling us not to take this too seriously. You know, I don't think there is a fundamental strategic Russia-China agreement. This is a marriage of convenience between two partners that fundamentally don't really get on terribly well. Thank you.
Cornelius, would you like to pick up on any of the comments here about Europe, China in particular, and where you may see other differences between U.S. and European approaches to global policy? Obviously, within NATO and Ukraine, there seems to be a lot of comity in terms of climate change, but where else do you see potential differences?
Yeah, thank you. And it's, first of all, I express my sympathies to the podium, because what happens when you put 4 Europeans on a panel like this, you know, quarreling about the details, the intricacies of European policies, as if the world out there wouldn't matter. You can actually spend an entire career inside European politics and think you'd work on foreign policy because you're working outside of your country's foreign policy. So, but it does matter, I have to say that. On China, what I would like to say is I'd be hesitant to compare or to draw quick conclusions from the EU's reaction to the Ukraine war to whatever might be a future China policy. And that's because there is a war in Ukraine, and there is not yet a war which China is involved in. By the way, I guess the one thing that Mr. Karaganov and I agree upon is that it is an ugly war, as he said in this morning's panel. So I appreciate his frankness in saying something out loud, which would give him 15 years in prison in his home country. But that being said, what the European Union does is remarkable also in the military sense. The European Union today and tomorrow, there is a meeting of the foreign ministers and the defense ministers. They are likely to pass the 9th sanction package against Russia. They are spending or dispersing more money to support the purchasing of military equipment through member states for Ukraine. They are also, let's not forget, they are working with Belarus, Belarus being the country sandwiched slightly between Ukraine and Russia and being part of the Russian sphere. So these are things that the European Union is doing in response to Russia's invasion. Many people would have said since 2014, since Crimea was annexed and the war had begun in eastern Ukraine, the European Union have stepped up much earlier. But it didn't. Why? Because the case couldn't be made. There was always room for ambiguity that member states, including the country that I know best, would always point to Russia's reliance in energy issues, the need to work with Russia, and all these, or many of these doubts, I should say, have been taken away by the invasion on February 24th. So all of a sudden, Europe was propelled to action, doing something that it couldn't have done before. I'm not going to make any predictions about what this means for China, but I think the whole world is right now learning some important lessons of how interdependent each of our economies are, how much own worldviews may collide with other countries' worldviews, that our point of view may not necessarily be the universal point of view. So that is something that one should keep in mind when it comes to extrapolating to issues like China. And just one remark, because you were trying, I believe, to get to other policies, climate, energy, the green transition, which was at the heart of this current European Commission's term. We have 5-year terms for the European administration, and they began in 2019, November 2019, and they put what they call the European Green Deal at the heart of their political program. 3-4 months later, COVID hit. 2.5 years later, the war in Ukraine hit. But because I said that before, the institutions are sticking to it. With all the setbacks we're experiencing, we have been experiencing over the summer when it comes to energy, importing more gas, more oil, even chopping the woods to have fire for the winter. That's crazy as it sounds, but this is a possibility. The Europeans are sticking to that vision of implementing a European Green Deal. So they are tying this into other policies and not just focusing, say, on the military response or sanctions or whatever.
Good. We should talk briefly about the Middle East, and time is short, so short answers, please. Do you see a role for European autonomous engagement in the Middle East, and if so, where? The US and Europe seems to be in sync regarding Iran, for example, but has space or would space open up with regard to the Israel-Palestine issue? We see that President Macron has been active in Lebanon, for example. Where do you see the European role in the Middle East, and do you see this as part of the realignment we've been talking about today?
I see definitely a role for Europe in the Middle East. However, I'm afraid Europe doesn't see a role for itself in the Middle East. Where it breaks down is that individual member states, be that France, Germany, others, see their roles, but not the collective European message that we should be carrying to the region. One serious failing of Europe is to recognize the value that it can have in a strong relationship with the GCC, with the Gulf. The ambition there has been very limited, to say embarrassingly limited. It needs to be much more focused on issues that are relevant to both Europe and the Gulf. For example, climate change, green technologies, food security, you name it. Certainly, the conflict there is between the ambitions of individual member states in terms of their own foreign policy in relation to the Mediterranean, to the Middle East, to the Gulf and other parts of the region, and the inability of the institutions in Brussels to come up with coherent messages for that. But that, I think, is inevitable because it is part of going back to your first question of going back to the strategic autonomy that Europe needs. Because Europe does need that strategic autonomy to develop its policies, because Europe doesn't see the world divided into friends and foes. And I think that's what makes Europe a little bit different from others who are competing to be the president of the world or the global leader of this or that. Because our vision is really that we need to be able to talk and work with everyone, to have relationships that are both in the interest of both sides. And that is why we will certainly see China differently from the Americans. That's why we certainly need to see the Middle East in a different way. And that's why certainly we need to pay more attention to South Asia, for example, India, Southeast Asia, and further and beyond. That uniqueness of Europe's approach hasn't yet materialized at the level of European foreign policy. It will, and I believe it will. It needs to go through a transition period that hopefully we're embarking on now, and certainly that will reflect also in the Middle East. But I would personally be very mindful of the vast potential that we can find for the benefit of global good, for the benefit of Europe, for the benefit of the region, in strengthening the partnership between Europe and particularly the countries in the Gulf. And hopefully, you know, with Ebtisam's kind agreement to have us here for this wonderful conference today, that is something that we should be discussing more in the future.
Okay, thank you. Marco.
I don't believe that Europe can play a role in the region. There are too many issues to face at the moment, and I don't see the stamina in the European institution to be effective in the region. I mean, there are various reasons. The first one is the one I just mentioned. The second is that the dynamic between the US and the EU as to the Middle East has always been an unbalanced dynamic. He has been special envoy for Middle East peace process from the UN side. I've been special envoy for Italy for the Middle East. And we have been for a few years involved with this closed mechanism consultation. It's called QUINT. It's the European 5 countries plus the United States. And, you know, the experience has been, I could say, depressing in the sense that usually the meeting was, the Americans came, say what they want to do, and basically we Europeans were taking notes. Sometimes someone raised the hand to say, we could no, it's already decided with the party. We cannot change a single sentence. That's it. Okay, bye-bye, thank you for informing us. And the third reason I would say that has been a very, very clever Israeli politics vis-à-vis Europe. And I'm going to touch something very sensitive on this point. Israel has been quite effective in weaponizing anti-Semitism, up to a point that there are many European leadership at the moment. They do not even think for a moment to criticize not Israel as a country, that would be, and Israel as the Jews as a people would be clearly anti-Semitic, but to criticize any single move by an Israeli government. We had only far-right government in the last few years because you cannot sustain the possible accusation of anti-Semitism. This has paralyzed the European leadership, indeed, in fact, not only with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but as to the rest, as I said, in terms of engaging with the Arab world, I have watched very disappointing result in the last 10, 15 years. Thank you.
Charles?
Let me give you a NATO answer and an EU answer. In the Madrid NATO summit back in June, the Spanish government was very worried that because of NATO's obsession with Ukraine, totally justified as it was, NATO would forget about the southern flank. Well, there's a sentence in the strategic concept about the southern flank. It doesn't really add very significantly, frankly, to what NATO is doing for the stability of the region. But let me just mention one interesting fact I recently came across, and that is that 10 out of 20 of the Middle East and North Africa countries, the MENA region, have now have precision-guided munitions. They have the capacity basically to launch either sea-based or air-based missiles. So this is a specific security issue that NATO is looking into, and they've developed this concept which they call forward resilience, which is not about becoming involved in the region, it's about strengthening the resilience of states in the region to deal with non-state actors, essentially, terrorism, organized crime, and so on. But to be honest, I think the NATO toolbox is not very well equipped to deal with the kinds of challenges that we face in the South. The EU traditionally has seen itself as the major player in the South because of its whole-of-government approach. But again, as has already been said, resources are limited. Our southern neighborhood policy, to be honest, has not been a great success in recent years. And I think we really lack a serious, well-thought-through neighborhood policy in the South. We can continue to talk about, whatever's left of the Barcelona process and its successor institutions, but that really isn't going anywhere. So I think the EU really needs to rethink its role in the South.
Cornelius.
Just briefly, and I'm trying to marry the two responses from the two former UN special envoys, the principled optimism, if I can say so, from Nickolay, and the list of difficulties that Marco has presented. And he's right. There are difficulties that hinder the European Union from playing a more active role, but maybe they're not cast in stone. They don't have to be around for the next 20 years. And let me even flip this around and ask, not you personally, but ask the question back to countries like the United Arab Emirates, like the Gulf Cooperation Council. What is in for you in cooperating with the European Union? I guess that in the past it was more the EU, probably in a more patronizing way, coming along and saying, well, you should cling together like we did because, cooperation is a good thing. Why don't you do X, Y, Z, and here is how we can help you. But the thing is that the Europeans didn't start collaborating because they are angels or anything. No, because there was a hard-nosed interest in uniting the continent after those two devastating world wars. And still, with all the special interests that certain member states have in this region, let's find the overlap. Let's find the overlap of some interests and have a cooperation on this. So it's not just the European Union coming and, well, by the way, they did develop a strategy. It came out in May this year. The EU presented an EU Gulf strategy, outlining lots of ways how the European Union and the Gulf countries could work together. So pick up the document, see what is in there, and work on it. That's how it goes.
Very good. We are just about out of time. Oh, we'll take a question. Okay. Sada Rajmi. Abdallah, sorry. Abdallah El Rabbi?
Yes.
619.
I have a quick question about American involvement in Europe, especially after the Second World War, with Marshall Plan and NATO. Now, would Europeans consider themselves as alliance with the United States or agents who act in the name of NATO but for the American interest? I'm sorry if the question looks so superficial and silly, but that's what a lot of people think about today. So do we see Europe today independent and act for its own interest, or just an alliance or agents of United States?
Okay.
Andrew,
yeah.
Can we take the other question then we?
Yeah, we'll take
Please.
them all. Sure. Sada Rajmi.
Thank you. My name is Saad Rajmi from Kuwait, and my question is actually sort of a follow-up to an earlier chat with Senor Marco from Italy. Last September, I participated in a symposium called German GCC Dialogue in Berlin. And, you know, we've talked about the whole world. We solved the problems of the world, of course. But none of the participants, our German friends, have actually brought up any sort of peaceful strategy or peaceful outcome or a scenario for the Russian-Ukrainian war. And I was really taken aback and bewildered. I was like, my God, these are the children and grandchildren of the same people who have actually bore the brunt of the calamity of Second World War, and nobody's talking about peace or a peaceful, you know, exit from this dilemma. And I was asking Mr. Marco here, Senor Marco, what happened to the peace movement? What happened to the European peace movement? What happened to the slogan of make love, not peace? What happened to the songs of, you know, all we are saying is give peace a chance? I mean, like, there is no such a movement in Europe. What's happening in Europe? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. We've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds to respond to that. The U.S.-European, a word on the U.S.-European alliance given the history. And secondly, where's the peace movement in Europe regarding the Russia-Ukraine war? Nickolay.
Allies, not agents. But that is seen from an perspective inside Europe. Sometimes looked at it from the Middle East, it seems like agents, not allies. And that is part of the failing, I think, of politicians in Europe, is to explain what European countries or what the European Union does in a much more understandable manner to audiences, particularly outside of Europe, in the Middle East and Africa in particular, and maybe that relates to some of the history that European countries have with this part of the world. On the second question related to, you see the war in Ukraine in Europe is seen pretty much black and white. One country invades another. It is our responsibility, based on the values of Europe, to help the invaded country defend itself. That limits very much the prospect of movements as which you have pointed to. And of course, that also makes it look like there are very few opportunities for peacemaking. Sadly, right now, the openings for finding an exit out of this terrible war are very slow, very small, and we need to look very carefully to find them, nurture them, and look for opportunities to end the hostilities in a reasonable manner. And I think in that respect, that role currently cannot be undertaken by Europe. It needs to be undertaken by other countries.
Marco, again, very quick answers.
I will skip the first question, leaving more room for the other because I was directly addressed. I'm asking myself what happened to Europeans and Europe this moment. I've still not been able to find an answer. What I can say, there are three possible reasons for that. One is what is called in the psychological jargon groupthink. Everybody's thinking at the same moment, the same way, because basically that is the conventional wisdom, and the debate has been so weaponized that whoever is going to raise a different opinion is immediately labeled, but not only for the war in Ukraine, but on many other issues as someone that is out of the chorus. The other reason is what I call a cognitive dissonance. The more we have the tools to understand what's going on the planet, and the more we miscalculate. Maybe in artificial intelligence we will change that. I don't know. The third is what I call cognitive empathy. There's the increasing incapability for every actor to place itself in the shoes of the other in order to find a solution to a problem. It's the usual binary thinking. Either you think like I think, or you have no thinking at all. Thank you.
Charles?
Two interesting, apparently naive questions, but actually very deep questions, really. My quick answer to the first is that perhaps from outside Europe, people tend to underestimate the amount of debate that goes on within Europe regarding US foreign policy concerns. But just suffice it to say that, for example, during the Iraq War, in some countries, Spain, for example, criticism of American foreign policy was acute, it was extreme. So we have a very lively European conversation about US foreign policy, and don't think for a minute that people will automatically accept foreign policy, US foreign policy priorities as a given. As far as the second question is concerned, let me add something that hasn't been mentioned in this debate. I believe we're moving towards a multipolar world, and the problem with that is that we have appallingly deficient multilateral institutions. Where the hell is the United Nations in all of this? Totally absent. It may simply be that whenever permanent UN Security Council members are involved in a conflict, the UN collapses, it ceases to be effective. If that's the case, then we seriously need to rethink the role of the UN. But I think that is part of the answer. People are thinking about peace, but we don't really have anywhere to talk about peace in an effective, serious manner. Thank you.
I'm aware that the break is coming up, so I'll give you the shortest possible answer. I second what Charles said on the first question and what Nickolay said on the second question.
Good. Well said. Thank you, panelists. This was a fantastic discussion. I learned a lot. I know our audience did as well. Thank you. Thank you all for listening. Two good questions as well.
Thank you.